Hello, it is me, Josh Bloom. I am a little late because I am fighting a cold. When I say fighting a cold, I mean I am trying to keep it from becoming a full cold. You can hear it in my voice. That is the voice of cold fighting. As I explained in today's TikTok post of 1,461 Days of Ignoring the Trump Administration, which you can also watch on YouTube and Instagram, I fight colds by drinking tons of water. I drown them. This has worked for me. I don't suggest, I only confess. Speaking of 1,461 Days of Ignoring the Trump Administration, I am not speaking of it today because today's episode of the Josh Bloom podcast is the first edition of Josh Bloom's Right On Time Recaps, the film review series that runs right when you want to read. That is the catchy name I came up with for film reviews that I write and publish much later than you would normally see a film review written and published, because how many of us see a film the weekend it comes out anymore anyway? Yes, I have found a way to justify my unconventional schedule. I hope you will justify an unconventional reading and or listening experience. As I have explained over the previous few weeks of the Josh Bloom podcast, this first edition of Josh Bloom's Right On Time Recaps started out as a review of the new Spike Lee movie Highest to Lowest, but quickly became an analysis of that film and the film which inspired it, Akira Kurosawa's High and Low. I took notes about both films and started writing, and then kept writing, and eventually arrived at 9,000 words, which is almost 25% of the length of my book that is coming out on December 9. I will have more news about that and everything else that I love to update you about on the following episode of the show, which will be the usual installment of 1,461 Days of Ignoring the Trump Administration. For now, get ready to dig into an hour-plus long reading of my piece on Spike Lee and Akira Kurosawa, titled Dad's Pick on Their Recently Kidnapped Kids, in an Akira Kurosawa classic and its relit Spike Lee joint. I giggled a lot while writing this, and I even used some sound effects towards the very end. I won't be coming back at the end of this episode like I usually do, so I will have to check in with you about my incredible production trick on the next episode. Don't forget that you can buy me a coffee. Go to buymeacoffee.com/Josh Bloom. Only $3 to help me make up for the coffee I had to purchase on credit while writing the piece you are about to listen to for free. Reminder, you are listening for free, and it was not free to make for me. Also, let's celebrate the fact that this is episode 50 of the Josh Bloom isn't going to make a cutesy long-ass name for this episode because he is fighting off a cold, and that means that while he isn't conscious of putting in less effort, and if he was conscious of putting in less effort, he would be ashamed and appalled, but it is likely that his brain and therefore his body are not functioning as normal. It is reasonable to think that he may be cutting corners on the cutesy title that he usually comes up with before he says also known as the Josh Bloom podcast, also known as the Josh Bloom podcast. It is the first edition of Josh Bloom's Right On Time Recaps, the film review series that runs right when you're ready to read. Before we jump into this hour-long odyssey, which I will not be waiting for you at the end of, please let me say this now. Thanks again for listening. Please leave a 5-star rating for the Josh Bloom podcast in your podcast app, and leave a comment saying that you like the show. Don't forget to follow, and please tell a friend. This is a good episode to direct a friend to, because it is about the movies, and everyone loves the movies. You don't need to tell them about the political content that I also distribute. In fact, when they bring it up, you can act surprised. I didn't know that about Josh Bloom and the Josh Bloom podcast. I will not reveal your secret. Lastly, visit me everywhere for everything by going to superjews.com, that's superjerjews.com, or IamJoshBloom.com. Subscribe to my Substack, which contains all of my long-form writing, including this article you are about to listen to, at superjews.substack.com. Enjoy the show. I'll see you again very soon. Dad's pick on their recently kidnapped kids in an Akira Kurosawa classic and its relit Spike Lee joint. 1963's Kurosawa thriller High and Low and its interpretation by Lee, titled Highest to Lowest, both feature main characters running companies with ridiculous names. You are listening to Josh Bloom's Right on Time Recaps, the film review series that runs right when you are ready to read. Please note, do not listen if you do not like spoilers. Scene: August 16th, 2025, at the Jacob Burns Film Center, Pleasantville, New York. Do the Right Thing spoke to me as if it were speaking only to me when it was released in 1989. I was 17 years old, Brooklyn-born like the film itself, and freshly relocated back to New York from Michigan after abducting myself from my father's inhospitable home. I was very ready to receive Spike's message about fighting power. The film's opening sequence, featuring Rosie Perez dancing as free as freestyle can be to the iconic Public Enemy cut Fight the Power, one of the most essential tracks, not hip-hop tracks, just tracks, period, in all of music history, has remained imprinted on my psyche through the years as a counter to any bad memory that might try to hold me back. Rosie defied gravity, so I can defy gravity. I couldn't understand the black experience of bigotry, but I could understand Josh Bloom's experience of bigotry. At the time, I couldn't find the words to describe exactly what or who I was as I approached society's arbitrary age of adulthood, but I remembered that my bullies could and did. I became fascinated with Spike's story immediately, his point of view and his process. I tracked my way back to the beginning of his career with School Days and She's Gotta Have It. For his early films, Spike would release companion books. These volumes still sit on my shelves. When the 90s came and my mother went, I used a bit of the life insurance to buy a Laserdisc player and dove into the special features and additional behind-the-scenes information provided in the early years of commentary tracks. So early that I couldn't find the word commentary track to describe what I was learning about filmmaking, filmmakers, and the corruption of the film industry. After 1992's Malcolm X, I lost immediate touch with Spike's films, not because he changed, but because I did. I was 20 now, and I was discovering the corruption of the adult life industry for myself, which kept my focus somewhere besides film. Notably, Spike cranked out a film a year during this period. 1990's Mo Better Blues turned 18-year-old me onto jazz for the first time. 1991's Jungle Fever clued me into interracial romance. I loved Stevie Wonder's title track too, and still do. Can you imagine any artist covering this tune in current times? Then Malcolm X, which acted as a bookend to Do the Right Thing, circling back to the realities of racism then, 1965, versus racism later, 1989. As it turns out, I unfortunately feel like I will have to put some thought into understanding the difference between 1965's racism, 1989's racism, and 2025's racism, because 2025 is still pretty racist. I did manage to eventually catch most of Spike's films over the years since Malcolm X, and particularly enjoyed Inside Man in 2006, his last collaboration with Denzel Washington until this year's Highest to Lowest, the subject of the review I have yet to begin writing, and especially Black Klansman, which earned Spike his long overdue Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay, and was nominated for 5 more. My Spike fandom went viral on TikTok after Kendrick Lamar's 2025 Super Bowl performance. During Kendrick's halftime show, he mentioned the unfulfilled historical concept of 40 acres and a mule, which Spike had adopted in 1979 as the name for his production company, 40 Acres and a Mule Filmworks. I would have never known what this meant if he hadn't, so I passed this information on and found out that many were wondering what Kendrick was talking about at the big game. If I am walking into a Spike Lee film in 2025, then I am doing so with expectations, baggage, and personal memories that I do not want to be upended. Please don't make me leave a theater where I am supposed to be having fun with the notion that 17-year-old Josh had bad taste in directors' films or worse, their messages. I was worried when I cashed in a small piece of a gift certificate that my brother had given me for my birthday, accompanied by a note that said, "Let's reconnect," which we did not do. I hadn't spent time with him since the summer of 2023 and hadn't been to a film since the winter of 2025 when I saw The Brutalist, which I partially decided to attend specifically because it was so damn long and I felt like I was getting 2 films for the price of 1. Update. On September 3rd, 2025, I discovered that my brother used the remainder of the gift certificate he gave me for my birthday himself. Unfortunately, familial relationships can be more complicated than complimentary. Subscribe to my Substack and follow my podcast for updates on this reality, which too many people with siblings share. Building a career as a writer means living like a writer, which means living like a poor person who can't afford to go to the movies. I was worried that Spike would let me down by shooting an adapted screenplay that he co-wrote. I was worried that I would get busted for paying for a student ticket without a student ID. I was worried that I would trip and fall on the streets of Pleasantville, New York, while filming a video for you on my phone. None of these worries came to pass. Highest to Lowest is based on the Akira Kurosawa film High and Low, which I have not seen yet. Poor boys have their ways, though, and I have secured a trial HBO Max, or whatever some billionaire CEO is calling it, subscription to conduct my research. I will dip out of this review midway to start watching High and Low. Partially because I wanted to start writing already without seeing it, and partially because I am curious to see if seeing the original inspiration mid-thought will change my perspective on the work I have already wrought. I also wanted a reason to try out that rhyme. There is a scene towards the end of Highest to Lowest that made me say wow out loud. I had never seen a scene like this in any film, and it mirrored some shorter sequences earlier in the movie that made me a believer in Highest to Lowest, and more importantly, a believer in Denzel Washington's performance. This isn't to say I was ever any kind of Denzel detractor. His ability is A-list, but to dig a Denzel performance, you need to dig Denzel, and sometimes I do not. I found myself very annoyed by his pouty lip curls throughout, but that's part of the student price I pay to see Denzel in a Spike Lee film on a Saturday. I also wanted a reason to try out that rhyme. Speaking of corruption in the film industry, when I walked into my beloved Jacob Burns Film Center, I was surprised that Highest to Lowest wasn't playing in its main room. I guess I shouldn't have been, but I have been Spike-pilled since my teens, as I have explained. Instead, it was the Naked Gun reboot starring Liam Neeson, which I am told is fantastically funny, but isn't exactly art house fare. The Burns is a non-profit, so I understand why. They did the same with Barbie 2 summers ago. Sometimes blockbusters need to hit the art houses if the art houses are going to keep from going bust. This doesn't explain why Highest to Lowest is only receiving a token theatrical run before being shuttled off to whatever Tim Apple at Apple calls his streaming service this month, however. This seems pretty wild for a film also branded by A24, but maybe it is in line with the barely tentative respect even Martin Scorsese gets these days. His Killers of the Flower Moon still isn't available on physical media stateside, but at least it played in the big room at the Burns. The opposite is the case for Highest to Lowest, which is on the top floor in the tiny room, or intimate, the intimate room. Better. When I get there, an usher asks what I am seeing. I say Spike Lee to the young man who looks like a teenager. He replies, "Is that Highest to Lowest?" I joke, "Oh yeah, I just figured everyone knows who Spike Lee is, my bad. See Do the Right Thing if you haven't, it's a classic." To his credit, the young man actually seems interested in the information. The predatory parking system in Pleasantville, which requires me to top off a wallet, i.e., asks me for 3 times the amount of money needed to park so that the parking company earns the interest on my money instead of me before I can park, unfortunately keeps me from arriving in time to see all of the previews. This means I am late. Update. When seeing The Goonies a week later, my right-on-time recap is forthcoming, I finally found a new free parking lot in Pleasantville. Still, my money is continuing to earn interest for some billionaire parking app CEO instead of me. I am angry about it all over again as I edit. I did manage to catch the trailer for a film described as a thriller from top to bottom, which for a guy like me who eventually became a gay like me sounds like an exchange on Grindr. Ironically, the film has the sex-adjacent title Eden. I don't bother to jot down the title of the film previewed next because I am still stuck on sex and noting that it will be released by Janus Films, which reminds me of Anus Films, the side shingle of my friend Frank's distribution company Altered Innocence, which parodies the Janus logo. I am confident that I am the only person in this intimate yet sold-out room who is thinking this, much less making a note about it. Something wholesome follows. The obligatory Jacob Burns Film Center promo is always heartwarming. Today is a story of a man who basically grew up in the JBFC Kids program for aspiring young filmmakers. As an adult, he now sports a JBFC tattoo, which is quite cute, but inspires the uncute thought that someone is probably walking around with a tattoo of somehow heartbreak feels good in a place like this. The Nicole Kidman line from the AMC Theaters ad. Does that mean the place is the tattoo wearer's body? Watch along, Highest to Lowest. Apple Films. A24. 40 Acres and a Mule Filmworks. I wrote out the names of all 3 production companies to see how weird it would look, but nothing looks weird to me anymore. I am glad Spike still finds funding, frankly. I apologize for being reminded of the opening of Woody Allen's Manhattan as Highest to Lowest kicks off. Our collective film education doesn't account for what the filmmakers did or didn't do after we have already been influenced by their films. I'll put it this way, though, for the sake of the mob. That piece of shit scumbag Woody Allen's film Manhattan opens with Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue over shots of the New York City skyline, and Spike Lee's Highest to Lowest reminded me of this with its own drone shots of the skyline accompanied by Oh What a Beautiful Morning from the musical Oklahoma, as sung by Norm Lewis. Too tentative for primetime Taylor Swift collaborator Ice Spice was cast in this film almost a year and a half ago when her career was red hot, spice pun, so I was happy for her that she made it to the finish line of the film now that her career has cooled, ice pun. It was a surprise seeing the name Isis, Ice Spice, Gaston on screen. Ultimately, I am not sure what this cameo achieves for the film's narrative, but maybe Ice can spin acting into something because, according to the internet, peeps don't like that she raps about poop. Mentioning the proliferation of Ice Spice's poop patter seems as good a time as any to dip out of this discussion of Spike. I am going to watch the film that inspired him and take some notes. Watch along, High and Low. It took me an entire week of watching in bits and pieces to get through Akira Kurosawa's 1963 film High and Low. I almost ran out of my HBO Max trial subscription. This is not due to disinterest, it is the opposite. I planned to take a few notes, but I was so immersed that I wanted to savor the experience and not get distracted by documenting it. In other words, I didn't mean for this piece to turn into a review of High and Low 2, but on Josh Bloom's Substack, podcast, and YouTube, we do how we do. I also wanted a reason to try out that rhyme. Right away, I noticed a significant difference between Spike's film and Kurosawa's. High and Low is in black and white, and all of the actors are speaking Japanese. Just kidding. I am immediately drawn into what feels like a fundamental film education experience. I hated school, but I'm enjoying being schooled. I wasn't sure I heard it right when it became clear that the protagonist here, Toshiro Mifune as Kingo Gondo, is an executive at a shoe company. I remarked, wow, a business that actually has a future. Denzel plays this part as a record executive in Spike's update. There's no business like shoe business, and the record business is pretty close to being no business, I know. That said, the shoe company is named National Shoes. Can you imagine buying a shoe brand named National Shoes? Now that I say it, I wonder if we may be headed in that direction in America. 3 color choices: off black, matte black, gloss black for special occasions such as heterosexual marriages, for instance. I appreciate that Spike and his co-writer Alan Lowe have kept the theme of the executive who clings to authenticity while those around him are scheming to enrich themselves. I am forever fascinated by those in business who are not willing to take just a bit less money in exchange for the personal enrichment and customer retention that come from providing a superior product, one that makes people satisfied and happy. This would be not only enriching to the soul, shoe pun, but in the long run, shoe pun, this attitude and approach have the potential to make up the financial difference by establishing brand loyalty. Short version, why are so many executives idiots? Can we talk about the blocking in this film? Every frame is a photograph. I kept waiting for the characters to be placed in the frame in some less considered way, but cinematographers Asukazu Nakai and Takao Saito thought of everything. Another reason why it took me forever to watch High and Low is that I kept photographing the screen with my phone. I would rather look at stills from this film when I open my gallery instead of examining selfies for evidence of my aging, quite frankly. Absolutely beautiful. Even the High and Low Wikipedia entry mentions the film's blocking. Speaking of blocking, I don't smoke, but since we are living through the looking glass under a reckless, law-defying administration, why not try to block the toxins contained in tobacco from saturating the outside air? This is one way to help the environment, right? What the hell am I talking about? I am talking about a return to cigarette smoking indoors, a topic I have only tried to provide an ember of justification for in the previous few sentences for one reason: it looks cool. We need more indoor smoking in films. So far, High and Low is focused more on the attempt of the main character to take over his company from the inside than Spike chose to focus on, as we will discuss later. High and Low is also more focused on treating Kingo's wife, Kyoko Kagawa, as Reiko Gondo, as a second-class citizen. She offers excellent advice that Kingo ignores. She tells him that success isn't worth losing his humanity over, and he tells her that she wouldn't understand because it's business. Business is fucking stupid. What good did business ever really do for anybody? You can achieve success without involving business, just as it is possible to treat others with virtue without involving religion. Get your shit together, Kingo. This is the moment when I checked the release date of High and Low. It is 1963, because it sure felt more like 1950s America to me. I am now curious about the history of misogyny in Japanese culture, but that is for another time. For now, I took a moment to learn that what looked like a small backpack on Reiko is actually the elaborately tied knot of her obi, the broad sash worn over a kimono. I would never have known that if I had only watched Spike's joint. Let's cut back to highest to lowest now. As we zoom in from that opening that reminds me of that disgusting bastard Woody Allen's craptacular Manhattan, we see and hear Denzel as David King, carrying over a variation of the Kingo name from High and Low. Nice. David isn't a shoe salesman, he's a show salesman, presiding over a record label empire named Stackin' Hits, which is obviously some ode to label lore like Hitsville, but is the worst name for a label, actual or fictional, that I have ever heard. Like, what if you release your record on Stackin' Hits and it flops? For the rest of your life, everyone says, I guess your hit didn't make it into the stack, huh? When I hear Denzel, I'm like, oh, that sounds like Denzel. Denzel Washington has one of those voices that is comforting, not because of his tone. In fact, in many of his films, notably Training Day, his tone is quite menacing. But because it's just Denzel, baby. It is a familiar voice, and I'll take familiar these days. It doesn't take long to realize that money will figure prominently as Denzel argues about percentages on the phone while pacing about the high-floor balcony of his luxury building. Once he's back inside, among his collection of Basquiat's, reproductions based on Spike's actual collection, David soon moves the cash quarrel over to his wife Pam, played by Ilfanesh Hadera. Some fun facts that are fun because I find them fun. Ilfanesh is a fascinating first name. I do not remember ever seeing the combination of I and L at the start of a name. It looks like the Twin Towers on the page. Never forget. Also, Ilfanesh is 30 years younger than Denzel, which I personally have no problem with, and considering my early mention of Grindr, I tacitly endorse. But I am curious about this interesting narrative choice. I doubt that Mark Maron will ask Spike about this on the latest edition of his podcast, and maybe that is why Mark is retiring. In order to have followers, you need to be leading, David tells his teenage son Trey, played by Aubrey Joseph, a real-life lesson about influence that is mired in the culture of online influencers. Trey is a victim of toxic progress. Dad is right, if a bit trite, especially since he is the kind of father who makes a lot of promises but isn't really there for his son beyond the rhetoric. So far, this script isn't there beyond the rhetoric either. Trey is about to be kidnapped, but only for a short time, which will be a boon to his online notoriety, so I guess it's all good. David is too caught up in dealing with corporate drama inside of Stackin' Hits anyway. Strange seeing your whole life reduced to numbers, he says, about the brewing fight to either hang on to his piece of the company or engineer a takeover. His numbers comment can also be applied to his earlier criticism of Trey paying too much attention to his follower count. Like Kingo in the original High and Low, David is concerned that a corporate buyout will result in a sellout of the art. In this case, David is especially sensitive to how this will erode the label's positive impact on black culture. We know that the signature Spike Lee dolly shot is coming, but the nod to Samuel L. Jackson's character, Mr. Senior Love Daddy from Do the Right Thing, is a fun surprise. That's the truth, Ruth. So far, Highest to Lowest is not a film that a hungry filmmaker would make. Beyond David's casual concerns over the legacy of Stack and Hits in the black community, I do not feel encouraged to digest a message, which is what I am accustomed to from a Spike Lee film. I want to learn something. I appreciate Spike as a technician, but I appreciate him most as a storyteller. I'll be patient. Trey shouldn't feel bad that Dad is absent adjacent. It seems to be a personality trait, like when David arrives at the Stack and Hits office and a pretty girl with flowers in her hair asks him for 60 seconds of his time to perform a song. She begins, and the song is solid, but we see that David has left before she is finished. Why agree to give her the time in the first place, then? Patrick Bethea, played by Michael Potts, is David's colleague at Stack and Hits. I am already exhausted from typing this silly record label name. Patrick proclaims that AI is the future of music, another indication of this film's lack of intellectual hunger. Ironically, at this moment, I noticed the persistent score by a real person, Howard Drawson. Saturating his films with a jazz score is another Spike conceit, and I love being reminded of his late father Bill Lee's work. However, here, the playing is so ubiquitous throughout that one has to wonder if Drawson is trying to train AI all on his own. Pam is also putting on the pressure. She questions David's idealism, claiming he talks about the business more these days than about the music, and seems to wish he would cash in. Frankly, if I were pushing 70 years old with a partner 30 years younger than me, I'd be taking that fuck you money myself. Pam 1, David 0. Hey, at least in this film, the wife's sound advice is taken a little more seriously. In High and Low, it turns out that Kingo has bet his entire fortune, including the house, on trying to take over National Shoes, and casually tells Reiko about it after the fact. I realize now that maybe the crap name Stack and Hits is an ode to the crap name National Shoes. None of Pam's insights matter anymore anyway, when David and Pam get the call that Trey has been kidnapped. This entire sequence feels as melodramatic as a Lifetime movie, right down to Drawson's score. Kidnapping is the central plot point in both films. In both, the kidnapper means to take the main character's son, but makes the mistake of taking the wrong child, creating a crisis of conscience for both David and Kingo over paying a ransom demanded for an associate's kid instead of their own. It is noteworthy that in High and Low, the children are children. In Highest to Lowest, they are teenagers, but might as well be adults. This difference is important. The emotional stakes are so much higher when kids are kids, instead of athletic adults who look like they might kick a would-be kidnapper's ass, especially considering the less than imposing stature of the kidnappers in both films, as we will see. The concept of right versus wrong in the face of potential financial ruin is the most intriguing element of both movies. However, since it is money that matters most to these men, let me provide some raw data. The ransom demand in Highest to Lowest is $17.5 million. The ransom demand in High and Low is 50 million yen in 1963 money, which is equivalent to about 1.5 million today, leading me to understand that we are to believe the son of a shoe executive is worth $16 million less than the son of a record executive. This vocation-based crime standard is yet another anomaly that Mark Maron will forget to ask Spike Lee about, and if so, I am flummoxed by this stunning omission. Back to the action. In High and Low, It is revealed right away that the kidnapper has taken the wrong kid, in this case Shinichi, the son of Kingo's chauffeur Aoki, instead of Kingo's son Jun. In Highest to Lowest, both Trey and his best friend Kyle, the son of David's chauffeur Paul, played by Jeffrey Wright, you can read my review of his excellent 2023 film American Fiction on my Substack, are taken, allowing Spike to draw out the drama, leading to Trey being freed by mistake instead of Kyle, played by Jeffrey Wright's real-life son, Elijah. I prefer the former because of the narrative emphasis on the moral quandary over the crime. The first half hour of High and Low is squarely focused on the kidnapping and the crisis of conscience it presents. This ethical question is the primary reason both of these films exist. I understand the impulse to try to ratchet up the suspense in Spike's update to appease an assumed need for speed by a modern audience who would be offended by a cover of Stevie Wonder's Jungle Fever. Still, it is not demanded and distracts from what could be a more message-driven narrative. Since Spike's entire career has been built on message-driven narratives, I am not with him on this choice. Pam 1, David 0, Spike 0. High and Low also helps explain to me why the main characters seem to have a rather blasé attitude when they get the initial call about the kidnapping in Highest to Lowest. The same sort of atmosphere exists in the original film. I have yet to receive a ransom call, but I have a hard time believing my immediate reaction would be to the effect of, okay, how much? Versus a purely emotional reaction to the news that my child is in mortal danger. In both cases, the fathers of these kidnapped kids seem to skip over the fact that they are speaking to an abductor who should not be trusted to do anything they say they will do, much less return their children as promised. This is the moment when I look to my right at the Spike screening to confirm that I was hearing muffled laughter from my roommates during this sequence. I had yet to see High and Low at this point, and in the absence of this perspective, I joined in on the scoffing. Perhaps kidnappers were more trustworthy in 1963, and Spike was merely paying homage to the original. However, here, the ransom call plays as comedy. Also funny, seeing the word shit in the subtitles of a Japanese film. Kurosawa continues to play out the tension of the moral question when, unlike Denzel, who pretty much agrees to pay right away when he thinks it is still his son who is being held for ransom, Kingo stands firm and even goes as far as to berate Reiko for insisting that he can start over if he has to. Kingo counters angrily that Reiko knows nothing about poverty, but at this point, it is clear that she knows something about living with an argumentative man-child. What a baby! It is interesting how the way men communicate with their wives is presented differently based on the time and culture in which these two films take place. The chuckling continues in the intimate top-floor room at the Jacob Burns Film Center when a detective hunkered down in David and Pam's home/art museum receives a photo of Trey's green headband, which was actually being worn by Kyle at the time of the kidnapping, not Trey. This ham-handed reveal of the kidnapper's mistake feels forced and false, and wouldn't have been necessary if Spike just stuck to the question of morality instead of menace. I made a note about a smartphone screenshot of the Ebony Alert system, which almost feels like product placement, but is actually a real Amber Alert style system designed to find and rescue missing members of the Black community. I appreciate Spike's effort to spread the word, but his method feels clunky. Pam 1, David 0, Spike -1. But then, oh shit, sounds like Denzel again. Denzel as David now comes correct with what I was waiting for. His first negotiation with the kidnapper is also the film's first worth the student price of admission moment. True to the conceit of High and Low, now that David knows that the kidnapper kept Kyle instead of Trey, David complains that he doesn't want to pay. I feel strong right now as a member of the Front Row Chucklers. Remember, I arrived late because of being ripped off on parking and let out my first audible answer towards the screen. What? It appears as if Pam is pretty cool with David not paying the ransom for Kyle and letting him die. I hope this is going somewhere, because otherwise the run of this film in the tiny room is starting to seem justified. Trey, $17.5 million. Shinichi, $1.5 million. Kyle, $0.0 million. Damn, that's cold. The corporate takeover subplot in both films barrels into the kidnapping caper head-on in Highest to Lowest, a plot element absent from Kurosawa's original. When a loyal ally betrays their main man by revealing his shrouded takeover intentions to the opposing executives involved, only in Spike's version does this include attempting to leverage the kidnapping as a means of adding pressure to David's position. Spike's added commentary about the overlap of professional and personal among men with the need for greed adds to the cultural statements he has been making so far. Spike is willing to portray black men as bad, for being bad based on their ethics, not their ethnicity, because of his lifelong concern for the authentic legacy of the black community. Kingo and David are both men of artistic principle, for as much as dudes with too much dough can be. Still, in David's case, his concern for the degradation of black culture, specifically music, amid the progress that the growth of a black-owned business is supposed to bring, is notable. If there is a similar concern among the Japanese consumer shoe industry regarding the protection of Japanese shoe culture, I will need to educate myself on it. The chuckling continues upon Trey's release from his kidnapper's clutches. This event doesn't prompt empathy from anyone on the screen because apparently, as long as a kidnapper releases you, you're good to go and PTSD free. As Trey's concerns for his life return to concerns for his follower count, the kid with a Kamala Harris poster on his wall, which gets me in my feels but would only be on Trey's wall in his real life, film pun, starts screaming at his father, "Black Twitter is dogging me out!" David's reluctance to pay the ransom demanded for Trey's best friend is not going over too well online, which for a teenager is probably less preferable to the threat of death that he just escaped. David threatens to stack some hits on his recently kidnapped son for cursing at him, prompting this laughable line from Trey, "Best ears in the business, but the coldest heart." Oof. My eyes are rolling as I contemplate rolling early out of the tiny room, cute as it is. I will miss my mirthy roommates, however. For now, the chuckling is over, but I'm still here. David retreats to his office, where he pleads for guidance from framed photos of James Brown, Jimi Hendrix, Stevie Wonder, and Aretha Franklin. What would you do? With all due respect to these musical icons, I do not think these are the folks I would seek consultation from about whether or not to pay a ransom to a kidnapper in exchange for my chauffeur's son. I also wanted a reason to try out that rhyme. This entire sequence becomes overwrought as David waffles back and forth, first refusing to even agree to tell the kidnapper he will pay just to buy more time, and then eventually agreeing to pay for real after all. In High and Low, Kingo's moral quandary, again, the aspect of both films that means the most to me, is internalized and intense. Spike relies too heavily on Denzel as David's lip curls and his begging for advice from dead James Brown. Hey, at least we get the famous floating Spike Lee double dolly shot out of this. It's always a pleasure to see. My patience is wearing thin with David, but eventually both he and Kingo decide to pay the kidnappers for the safe return of their respective chauffeurs' children, hoping that law enforcement will be able to recover the ransom money. I suspect that rich and powerful executives who may have less interest in the value of artistry might ultimately decide not to. I'll just get a new chauffeur so I don't have to be reminded every day that I let his son die. Wow, that was an incredibly cynical sentence. In both films, the money exchange is set to take place on a train, or more specifically on the subway in Spike's. I adore that Kingo's career as a shoemaker, who has not abandoned his craft, comes into play when he begins to work on altering the briefcases that will contain the cash to conceal 1963-style tracking devices, one of which provides a stunning visual moment later in the film. There is no parallel to this in Highest to Lowest. David could have cut a test pressing of a recording of the ransom note if there had been one. Why wasn't I in the writer's room? The suspense that Kurosawa creates in his train sequence proves that the incessant and inescapable jazz score so far from Spike's isn't necessary. Still, Drawson's unending score is fantastic in this segment, even though I feel like I am in a basement club in the West Village and not in the top floor tiny room in the village of Pleasantville. Regardless, I finally feel invested in Highest to Lowest after nearly packing up my little purple notebook with matching Uniball 1 pen in the color grape moments before. The pen is made in Japan, which serves as foreshadowing. The howling in my row has now turned to head bobbing. Like I said, the score got dope. I am appreciating the solidarity and also the solid that Spike serves up in the form of a cameo by the gravity-defying woman I mentioned earlier. Rosie Perez makes an appearance as herself just as the money handoff happens in a truly successful suspense sequence from Spike that transitions to the streets during a Puerto Rican Day celebration featuring a live performance by Eddie Palmieri and his salsa orchestra. Bravo, bro. Kurosawa continues to lean on the elements of this story that I love most. The crisis of conscience is augmented as we learn the kidnapper's motive. He wants to humiliate Kingo. This is about class warfare. Kurosawa makes quick work of striking this stark contrast between the haves and have-nots, and then moves on to solving the crime. Spike, not so much. The immense public acclaim that both Kingo and David begin to receive for doing the right thing, to gank Spike's saying, is utilized to best effect in the Kurosawa film, rendering the kidnapper's non-monetary motive of shaming Kingo moot. What's with dads picking on their recently kidnapped kids in these movies? David's threatening posture with Trey after the kid returns home from, again, being kidnapped is even more intense in High and Low. I realize that Kingo's chauffeur is stressing about the money Kingo put up, but damn, he is really hard on his son, who is 9 or so in the film, not 19 or so like in Spike's, for not being able to recount every minor detail of his abductor and abduction. Shortly after berating the boy, a detective reveals that the kidnapped kid had a cloth soaked in ether over his face during the crime. Pop has got to slow his roll. That's the double truth, Ruth. If I didn't mention that the last 30 years of my life have been spent in the music industry, I just did. Clearly, this aspect of highest to lowest both intrigues me and draws my scrutiny in a way that high and low can't, although I do enjoy a good cobbling video on YouTube from time to time. While we don't learn anything during Kyle's interrogation about being assaulted with ether, which frankly today's teens might huff on their own without the participation of a kidnapper anyway, we do learn that Kyle heard an unidentified rap song on repeat in the apartment where he was held. David's best ears in the business eventually come to the rescue as he manages to figure out the song. Young Felon, in keeping with this film's horrible habit of creating cringe-worthy names, is the rapper in question, as played by real-life rapper A$AP Rocky. Pam won. David won. Spike, -2. Like the kidnapper in High and Low, Young Felon is obsessed with the man, not just the money. In Highest to Lowest, the motivation is even more personal. The reason David was able to figure out the song Kyle heard is that Young Felon had previously tried to get David's attention as an artist, instead of as an abductor. No word on whether the kidnapper in High and Low was an aspiring Jimmy Choo. This is an essential clue to recovering David's money, but unfortunately David's colleague Patrick, the one who crowbarred in his AI hot take earlier, has sold him out. This money is not actually David's disposable ransom fund, after all. Now he may be facing fraud charges for using the investment funds to save Kyle. No good ransom payment goes unpunished. Patrick's excuse for selling out his friend is personally selfish and professionally unethical. I'm just trying to protect myself because in this business, no one else will, he says, trying to justify his behavior. Take it from me, with my background in the music industry, this attitude is rooted in reality. David's ears may be best and his heart coldest, but there are plenty of cold hearts to go around at Stackin' Hits. After establishing the class warfare concept, Kurosawa continues to keep High and Low locked in as a police procedural. It turns out that back in 1963, good old-fashioned detective work, a 16mm camera, and a few photographs were all the tools needed to solve a crime. It is similar to when a restaurant offers fewer choices in favor of focusing on higher quality. The end result is superior. Bringing some much-needed comedic relief on the crime side of the story is a character I quickly fell in love with. Chief Detective Bosun Taguchi is the partner of the chief investigator on the case, Inspector Takura. There is no equivalent character in Highest to Lowest, and so no comedic relief, other than what my roommates and I make up and a notable one-liner later. I made a note early on during Highest to Lowest when David's partner Patrick was introduced. I wondered if perhaps Patrick was involved in the kidnapping. This was never explored, but he certainly turned out to be the compromised heel who could have been. Perhaps this was a subplot that was discarded, and I picked up on the scent because in High and Low, my beloved Bosun calls the national shoe executives assholes, according to the subtitles, and implies that he is suspicious when interviewing them. I just knew Bosun and I had a connection. Good old badass Bosun. David is fixin' to stack some more hits as Paul drives him to Young Felon's pad to the two-on-the-nose tune, The Payback by dead advice giver James Brown. How meta of me to wonder about the licensing fee paid to the owners of the recording and publishing of this song for its use in a film about a record executive.
Kudos to whoever wrote the one-liner delivered by Paul when David asks why he's carrying a pistol. Insurance. That's Jake from State Farm. Back with Boston, it's no brawn necessary as the detectives continue a stunningly addictive run of intense attention to detail. When one notices the sound of a train in the background of one of the calls with the kidnapper, the idea is hatched to find out who might be able to identify that particular train by the specific sound of its wheels on the rails. When the detectives find the engineer who can provide the big payback of the ransom that Kingo desperately needs, we are treated to one of those one-scene film roles that is worth remembering. The engineer's clues lead the detectives towards the train line, and young Shinichi pinpoints the hut where he was held and where the kidnapper's accomplices now lie dead from a pair of heroin overdoses, likely due to the kidnapper providing them with uncut product. I am surprised by the press conference that follows. The detailed description of the drug overdose deaths seems very hardcore for a film from 1963. The subsequent discussion of the heroin trade in Japan at the time takes me from surprised to shocked as a subplot opens up about the depravity of the Japanese underground drug trade, which continues to broaden the class warfare narrative that defines high and low. This unexpected insertion of an additional moral issue leads us into another sharp plan from the team of detectives who do not need DNA to crack crimes. The idea this time is to flood the newspapers with false information claiming that the kidnapper's accomplices are still alive to draw him back to their hut for another stab at the vein. Before we check back in with David and young Felon, I need to vent about a sequence involving a vent. I spent what felt like a day and a half searching for information about the pink smoke that provides the stunning visual that I mentioned earlier. Yes, this black and white film contains pink smoke. I was so stunned and enchanted by this that I had forgotten the context in which it appears. I don't know what role AI will play in the demise of humanity, but I know that ChatGPT only made figuring this sequence out harder, not easier. I got into a fight with ChatGPT at one point as it continued to deliver increasingly bizarre information, and I found myself frustrated by its unwillingness to fight back. For me, a significant shortcoming of AI is its inability to meet me where I am at, and I am usually at annoyed. Kingo planted a capsule in one of the money briefcases that would emit pink smoke if the briefcase was burned. On the cinematography tip, even though color film was available in 1963, this effect of pink smoke rising into the air against an otherwise black and white frame was achieved by hand coloring the film itself. Pink, if true. If memory serves, and I just spent the last 3 paragraphs describing that it doesn't, the kidnapper sees the newspapers proclaiming that his accomplices are alive. He freaks out and burns the briefcases at a briefcase burning facility. The facility may be used for burning other items, but I needed the laugh right now. When the pink smoke is released, we can see it from the windows of Kingo's apartment, revealing the kidnapper's approximate proximity to the scene of the crime. When detectives question the proprietor of 1-800-BURN briefcase, they pick up more clues as to the kidnapper's identity and pinpoint his location. Kingo spends the majority of his time in High and Low, held up in the luxurious apartment that, unbeknownst to him until this point, overlooks the kidnapper's hovel, where the kidnapper slowly becomes envious of Kingo's high compared to the kidnapper's ever-lowering low. In contrast, David is out here in these streets with his boy Paul, ready to hold up anyone who steps to them. David is about to head up the steps to young Felon's apartment looking for his money. He is met at the door by Young's girlfriend Rosa, played by rapper Princess Nokia, who recognizes David from the news about the kidnapping and invites him in. When Rosa reveals Archie, young Felon's real name, which makes me wonder why not tag yourself Arch Criminal instead of Young Felon, named their baby boy after David, it raises some questions. 1. Why would Rosa only recognize David from the kidnapping news and not because her boyfriend is obsessed with him? 2. Why would this role not be played by Ice Spice, which would turn her initial inconsequential appearance into an instance of foreshadowing? Or why not cast Pink Pantheress in this role as an Easter egg type nod to the pink smoke in High and Low? 3. Instead of kidnapping Trey and Kyle to get David's attention, why didn't he just try flowers in his hair in the Stackin' Hits lobby? 4. Again, why wasn't I in the writer's room? Kingo eventually confronts the kidnapper in prison after he is apprehended, following a fascinating and extended glimpse into Japan's underground. This features a Jack Rabbit Slims style dance scene, which, like the famous Pulp Fiction sequence, involves heroin, and a trip down a back alley opiate avenue as the detectives go undercover as dope addicts to track the kidnapper as he seeks out a subject to test the potency of his score on. David's eventual confrontation with young Felon provides the most intriguing sequence in Highest to Lowest and is purely Spike's invention. The scene, staged in young Felon's studio, is the one that made me say, wow, whoa, and what? Instead of trying to elicit a confession, David deigns to produce a young Felon's session. These two men, one young, one an OG, confuse and confound, and it's not just me. Denzel as David tries to make the track hot, then ASAP as Young fires through the studio window with one shot. I also wanted a reason to try out that rhyme. I have never seen a scene like this in a film before. That's the wow. Denzel brings gravity because he's Denzel, especially with what turns into an improvised rap battle, which could have easily bookended the earlier laughter from my row, but plays real. Denzel is an aging record executive who came up in the game. His performance in this scene sounds authentic to what his character's history says he should be. That's the woe. Unfortunately, the what is how unrealistic and improbable this scene is in the first place. Kinda like David's teenage son sporting a Kamala Harris poster on his wall. Not likely. David, you're there to confiscate your bread. Stop wasting time trying to mess with young Felon's head. I used to be on the Brooklyn Bridge just looking up at you. At your terrace, young Felon tells David, recalling the prison confrontation between Kingo and the kidnapper at the conclusion of High and Low, when he talks about the growing envy from seeing Kingo's house on the hill every day, leading to the commission of his crime. After shots are fired, the ensuing melee leads David and Young to a physical altercation, again on the subway, where the most emotionally resonant portion of their shared on-screen time unfolds. Let me go, man, Young pleads as David subdues him, and Young hangs just above the tracks of the speeding train. Come on, man, he begs. I don't want to be here. Let me go. And finally, let me die, man. You lucky you got a son named after me, David remembers in a moment of clarity and empathy as he pulls young Felon to safety. Get your ass up here. The exchange is incredibly powerful. and serves as the emotional high point of highest to lowest. David recovers his money, and young felon becomes a superstar following his arrest. Young felon is now officially a young felon. David is the guy who was willing to enter into a rap battle with the man who kidnapped his son and his son's best friend, in addition to absconding with a $17.5 million ransom, so of course he grants young felon a final jailhouse meeting. Now, young felon makes his last-ditch pitch to David. He is now a bona fide superstar, and he wants that record deal with stacking hits that set this whole mess in motion. David, showing the cold heart that Trey warned about, passes on signing young felon. I guess kidnapping his son and attempting to kill him soured David on the deal. Understood. I'm only playing the game y'all motherfuckers invented, Young yells, before being led away by guards after lunging at David. Big and not untrue. Highest to lowest draws to a close, back at David's pad/wing of the MoMA. He has gathered with Pam and Trey to hear Sula's audition, a young singer played by Alyana Lee, who wrote the film's title song, which she is about to sing. Trey has been trying to turn his father on to Sula's music throughout the film, and this moment provides an amicable resolution to their rocky relationship. David likes what he hears this time, and amid a flurry of warnings and truth bombs about the rigors of the music industry, he seems ready to offer Sula a deal. The girl with flowers in her hair, and young felon of course, will be so pissed. David is starting a new label now where he can uphold his artistic standards forever, or at least until the next kidnapping. Pam won. David won. Spike, -1. Sula won. Highest to Lowest is a weird movie. It's all over the place. The sheer amount of stunt players in the credits of the adaptation of a film that mostly takes place in an apartment speaks to that. But its heart isn't. I understood it better after watching High and Low. High and Low suggests that big business bleeds out the ethics and morality of the big businessmen that it turns bad. This message stays intact in Highest to Lowest. Kingo and David both survive their crisis of conscience in the face of financial ruin, and as the high and highest of these films, both men ultimately come to understand the class warfare motivating the crimes of the low and lowest. I have not spent enough time with Kurosawa in my life. I have tried, but I have always trailed off. Now that I am feeling high on High and Low, simply for being so astounded and engaged, even though it has taken me days, I will try again. I love Spike, and despite my criticisms of his adaptation of High and Low, it is the fact that he got me to watch the original that is the most rewarding part of Highest to Lowest for me. Pam 1, David 0, Spike 0, Sula 1.